Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our discussion with Dr. Anansi Wilson here on critical race theory. Just to let you know a few things before we get started, this discussion will be recorded and available on Acquia's YouTube channel in a few days. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end though, so please reserve your questions until then. Feel free to drop them in the chat, however, as we go through, and we'll go to those questions once we get to the end. If you do have any technical issues as we're going along, you can also drop that in the chat and we'll try to assist you there, okay? So without further ado, I am honored to have Dr. Anansi Wilson with us today, and it is my pleasure to introduce him. Dr. Wilson is a professor of law, award-winning scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, a racial justice strategist, and an author of creative nonfiction. Dr. Wilson's legal research is situated in legal philosophy, critical theory, political economy, and constitutional law. His writing and scholarship primarily focus on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. Dr. Wilson's work analyzes the ever-changing relationships between race, law, sexuality, power, and citizenship, both in the construction of law and policy and the maintenance of the way we live our lives. Dr. Wilson's teaching and interests include criminal law, criminal procedure, constitutional law, federal criminal civil rights, the 4th, 13th, and 14th Amendments, Reconstruction, political and civil rights, critical race studies, LGBTQ issues, and all areas pertaining to race, law, and society. Dr. Wilson employs critical race, Black feminists, performance, and women and gender studies, and legal methodologies to examine how instances and legal precedents of anti-Black violence and racial sexual terror continue to frame and impact notions of Black being and citizenship. Professor Wilson employs a multidisciplinary gaze to engage the creative, the legal, and the literary to uncover an emerging approach to encountering, understanding, and extrapolating anti-Blackness as a jurisprudential logic, underpinning and precedent embedded in the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and decisions they form. So, excuse me. So it goes without saying, our speaker today is well suited to discuss and educate us further on today's topic, critical race theory. So remember, we will be holding a Q&A session at the end, so please reserve your questions until then, and feel free to drop them in the chat. With that, I will stop, and let's all welcome Dr. Wilson to begin.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Kimberly. All the smiles you're giving me now, and thank you everyone for being here. Like Kimberly said, we'll actually have a lot of time for extended Q&A. No question is too dumb or too simple, nor too complicated, I hope, after all this school. So with that, I'll begin. And what I'm going to do is read a couple scenarios to you and give you a kind of an overview of critical race theory that will inform the discussion that we have afterwards. This was written in 1852. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sound of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrant, brass-fronted impudence, your shout of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all of your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which could disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and more bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. This was July 5th, 1852. Frederick Douglass addressing some white women abolitionists and other wealthy folks up north, and I believe in Boston. Oftentimes when people think about critical race theory, they don't think about the folks on the wall behind me. So you have Frederick Douglass, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin. Well, they most certainly think about Angela Davis, but that's a conversation for another day. Critical race theory is not some notion of trying to pit children or people or racial groups against one another. Instead, critical race theory implores us, invites us, and empowers us to take a critical lens to examine the way that race itself, racism in particular, and specifically white supremacy and anti-Blackness, are embedded in the ways in which America is constructed, specifically in law. And it also argues that as racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy are embedded in law, they have a life just like the law that lives beyond the courtroom. So it manifests or orchestrates oftentimes, or at least influences, the way that we engage with each other. It creates a particular type of social order, or if you're critical about these things, you might say a social disorder. So critical race theory was formally started as a response to the failures of the civil rights movement. Essentially, a group of Black legal scholars and also other scholars of color came together to critique what they saw as the losses and the perceived failures of liberalism in the United States. They realized that even though a Voting Rights Act had been passed, there were still myriad threats and blockades against the right to vote. They realized even though a Fair Housing Act was passed, Black folk across the country and Latinx folks across the country still lacked access, fair access to adequate and fair and affordable housing, despite the promises of the law. And perhaps most controversially, after the decision Brown v. Board of Education that promised desegregation and allegedly ended, the doctrine of separate but equal, where white kids went to one school, Black kids went to another school. They were legally separate, but supposedly equally funded, equally taught, and of equal quality. So Brown is supposed to bring these children together and give them the same opportunities to learn together side by side and have the same teaching experience. Well, we understand that that actually didn't happen then, as in now. America is more segregated than ever, and students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students, are having a lower quality of education. So critical race theorists are coming together to say, what happened? What is going on here? How is it that even when the law says we are equal, or mandates that we are to be treated equal, we are still sitting in the back of the proverbial bus? What is going on? So they began to critique what came before them, the critical legal scholars. And these are folks that are saying, wait a minute, there's power behind our legal analysis. We're understanding that the wealthier you are in the world, or in the country specifically, you end up having more and more rights. And so the critical race theorists talk to the legal theorists, and they're saying, critical legal theorists are saying, wait a minute, you gotta talk about race too. So the tenets of critical race theory are fairly simple. One, posited by Derek Bell, that racism is endemic. It is a part of the American fabric due to the original sin of slavery, and it has its afterlives in the precedents and decisions of our judicial system, as well as in our legislative. That's one. Two, another Derek Bell idea, the notion of interest convergence. So the idea is that Black rights and rights for other people of color in the United States are unstable. They often rely on convergence with the interest of white folks in power. So for example, Derek Bell compares the United States Civil Rights Act with what is happening with the Cold War. So during the Cold War, United States is essentially saying, yo, Russia, how can you tell us about democracy? How can you tell us about equality when you are literally lynching Black people across the South? When folks in your country are demonstrating and protesting and being mowed down with hoses and guns. So Derek Bell argues that the Civil Rights Act is actually pushed as a foreign policy matter because it allows the United States to increase its global standing. But once the Soviet Union begins to fall apart and decrease in power and influence, so do Americans, African Americans' rights in general, in tandem, begin to fall apart. So the idea is, oftentimes in the United States, you'll see that you take one step forward and two step back, particularly when other people's rights or power or influence does not converge, what should be a fundamental right for you. Finally, intersectionality, the buzzword everyone tends to talk about and few tend to know. So intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw and her analysis of, I can always mispronounce this case, I think DeFred and Goyd versus General Motors. So in the 1960s, there was a kind of a recession going on, right? And General Motors goes to fire all of these Black women that are working for them. And the Black women file suit and they say, wait a minute, we're being fired because we are Black women. And the court says, well, there's no such thing as a protected class of Black women. That's not something that's in the Civil Rights Act. That's not something that's in Title VII. Either you can sue because you're being discriminated against because you're a woman, or you can sue because you're being discriminated against because you're Black. Well, they had a seniority system at General Motors that says the first in are essentially the first out. Known to the court and known to everyone at that time, previous to 1960, General Motors did not hire Black women at all. So Black women, of course, were the least senior and were then the ones to be fired. So Kimberly Crenshaw is arguing, and as we see in this case, that our identities, particularly when we're talking about race, gender, class, and sexuality, do not sit on different sides of the street. In fact, they exist in an axis. If not, they are compounded, right? And they come together to make us up, and they are inseparable. So oftentimes, these different identities are not the identities themselves, but the social structures that either privilege or oppress you based upon these things collude and collide to create unique types of discrimination or subordination. So in this case, we see that Black women are being uniquely fired because white women are not being fired even though they're women, right? And Black men are not being fired even though they're Black. So that is what intersectionality is saying. It's saying that we have to pay attention to the different ways that systems of power hit a person based upon the multiplicity of their identities, particularly those identities that are seen as despicable or disrespected or disempowered in particular ways, but particularly in the political and social realm. One of the other important things of critical race theory is what James Baldwin would call witnessing, or counter narratives. An example of that is we can look at the Cooper versus Cooper situation on, I believe, up north, right? Where you have Christian Cooper who is bird watching, and you have a white woman walking her dog. A simply fact-based way to tell the story would be to say, a white woman walked her dog in the park, she felt afraid of a Black man, and she called the police, right? Straight facts, she felt afraid, whatever. But a critical race telling of the story, a counter narrative telling of the story would say, wait a minute, you have a Black man who is standing in this park bird watching. He sees a white woman and her dog, greets her, actually says hello, and tells her to please put her dog on the leash because it is barking out of control. She then threatens him by calling the police. And to understand the power of this threat, we also have to understand the relationship between Black people and the police, particularly knowing that the police will engage in violence when we're talking about a white woman victim and a Black man without any evidence at all. So when we look at it like that, when we look at the kind of historical foundations of what's going on, we're able to see the actual power differentials at play here. Another example, before we move on to a bit of Q&A. In the late 1800s, after the end of the Civil War and during the kind of backlash to Reconstruction, there is a serious epidemic of lynchings in the United States. The purported reason for these lynchings by the Southern white domestic terrorists was that Black men are running around and raping white women. On its face, this is something that would be laughable if it wasn't genocidal. The idea that all of a sudden, all the Black men in the South, all these people being lynched, just start going and running around and trying to rape white women, just this far coming out of slavery, knowing the typical type of violence that might be visited upon them merely for being alive and present. So Ida B. Wells, in her book, A Red Record, goes down south and she starts investigating scores and scores of lynchings. And what she actually realizes in this kind of investigative, but also counter-narrative, counter-storytelling, is that oftentimes these Black men and women are lynched for, one, refusing to have sex, oftentimes with white people, for disagreeing with the white person. One case was a white man stole a Black man's cow, and the Black man dared to call the police. He was then lynched with the police's assistance. And there are so many other instances of Black folk being lynched merely for trying to register to vote, or trying to go to work, or actually trying to sell their crops at a fair price. So the crime for most of these lynchings is not only Black existence, but Black participation in the political realm, the social realm, and in the economy of the country. So we would not know that if early kind of pre-critical race theorists like Ida B. Wells didn't go down and do the work and tell the story, right, from the perspective of those being impacted by the law and not just those enforcing it. So in summation, critical race theory is merely about taking a critical approach to the law and oftentimes telling the story about the law's impacts, as well as its intent and its history, from the lens of those most impacted by the law, and putting that side by side with the dominant conversation of both history and present, so that you might get a little bit closer to the truth, right? Critical race theory takes us and asks us to wonder aloud, how do the logics and the beliefs of the founding fathers, those that were mostly slave owners, oftentimes self-avowed rapists of Black women on their plantations, and folks who didn't believe Black people were human and instead 3/5 human and 2/5 property, in order to kind of create the political system that we have now with our representation in the House and the Senate. What does it mean that their beliefs are the foundational beliefs of our legal system? And then what does it mean that our judicial system relies on precedent? So precedent itself then operates as a living will of those early white supremacist, rapist, slave-owning founding fathers, right? Because everything is rerouted rather, through their beginning arguments and their beginning beliefs. So critical race theory is challenging us today to take up the job, to take up the call, to re-examine the remnants of white supremacy, of anti-Blackness, of anti-Latinx sentiments, of nativism. And we saw what happened with Asian American folks in California and all over the country, these internment camps, to take up this call and cleanse our laws of these particularly violent white supremacist logics that don't always show up in something very clear, like the kneeling on George Floyd's neck here in Minneapolis, but that sometimes show up in the ways in which a student lives in the same zip code, but on one side of town, right? And has a less equal education, that is drinking lead-filled water in Flint, that happens to be a majority Black town. It's asking us to look at the clearly violent, but also the environmental racism and the subtle racism that infects and inflicts us with all types of harm and slow and rapid deaths. So with that, I would like to open it up for any questions or comments or pushback.
I think I'll start. Everyone feel free to drop questions in the chat, and I can take them as they come through that way. So initially, I think a question that probably everyone is wondering is, why are we just hearing about critical race theory now? And by we, I mean, you know, the masses. I feel like there's so much more in the media now about it than there was even a few years ago, a couple of years ago. Why do you think it has come to the forefront now with so many people?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the short answer is it's politics, right? So when I was talking to you the other day, I mentioned that it almost seems like we're in Groundhog Day, because 20 years ago, when I was only 11 years old, this same political morass was happening. The founder of critical race theory, Derek Bell, was being chased out of Harvard. Newt Gingrich was rising, talking about this attack on America, which is critical race theory. 20 years ago, almost to the month, that is what was happening. And of course, election season. So what we see is this type of attack on critical race theory and this enmeshment of critical race theory with some weird kind of anti-white human being thing or anti-white existence thing operates as a way to energize, of course, those who are aggrieved in the United States that are dealing with this kind of racial grievance, particularly low-income white folks that are being marshaled and being told that someone wants to take away your history, someone wants to attack your dignity. And not only that, people are coming to take your jobs. And not only that, you're not educated enough to understand this conversation. So it's being weaponized as a way to, I think, energize and feed off of the kind of energy and the deep grievances of folks that have been oppressed in America due to kind of our class and capitalist system, and Black people and other people of color become the scapegoats.
Right, okay. We have a question from Bernadette. She says, how might we begin to remove profiling, which contributes to mass incarceration?
Yeah, so like, I mean, this is why critical race theory, I think, is so key, right? Because we know what was happening in New York with stop and frisk, and the court there and higher courts later ruled that obviously racial profiling is unconstitutional. And so there really should be no profiling because racial profiling is unconstitutional. But to Bernadette, I think it was, but to their point, it's still a problem because these things exist beyond, right, the kind of Black letter or written law. And so the way that you have to do this is kind of like Groundhog Day. So now we're not calling it racial profiling. We're saying that someone lived in a high crime community, and that's why they were stopped, and that's why they were questioned. Well, who lives in a high crime community? Probably people that are more low income because there are more police in the area. So more crimes aren't actually happening, just more arrests are happening. There's more surveillance and attention to those communities. So what we have to do in order to get rid of things like racial profiling and these kind of police violences is to really speak plainly, right? And to look at the facts of what's happening and not get caught up on the procedural mess or on the kind of linguistic jujitsu that a lot of politicians and big kind of Blue Lives Matter people try to push. We know what's happening, to your point. It's still racial profiling. And I think that sometimes in the law, and particularly in politics, particularly when we're talking about so-called public safety or policing and crime, people like to do this word salad thing and confuse you and act like you don't know what you're talking about, but we should be able to speak simply and demand that the people that are in power speak simply and merely call a spade and say that, no, this is still the same thing. This is lipstick on a pig. This is racial profiling in a new suit. And so to your point and to your question, I think what we have to do is really to call it out and to be insistent and to draw the dots and not be ashamed in pulling up our own personal testimony and histories, both as an individual, but also with your family and the long history of Black folks and people of color in this world, to say, wait, this is the body of evidence. And I will not be swayed by new words or languages or types of procedural excuses that are meant to confuse and deter me.
That was a great question, Bernadette, thanks. Let's see. We have one from Corey here. So he says, while I find the shared interest concept disheartening in that real progress is only made when groups other than those oppressed and disenfranchised also benefit, I also find it intriguing in that it provides non-linear avenues to progress that are likely to face resistance from anti-progress and racist groups or forces. Similar to the influence of the Cold War on domestic process, are there other examples you might speak to help in driving home that pattern or juxtaposition? And are there any current day overlaps that are helping drive progress?
Yeah, so progress is interesting to think about, right? Because sometimes the question becomes progress to whom and for how long? So if we think about something like the National Hate Crimes Act, it comes together because you have a very violent, homophobic murder of a young boy in Montana who is essentially beaten and tied to a barbed wire fence. And then you also have the violent dragging of a young Black boy in the South, right? And Black folks had been pushing since the 1800s for a law that says, wait a minute, maybe it should be illegal to lynch somebody. And that didn't even pass until last year when Kamala Harris pushed it through the Senate. But the National Hate Crimes Act came together because there was a very organized and very strong, and I'm thankful for it, white queer lobby that's saying we are being assaulted in these ways and this is very gruesome. So of course, in that moment, you get Black folks getting protection from hate crimes and you get white, queer, and ostensibly all queer, but we see how intersectionality works. Everyone doesn't get protected. Folks being protected from particular types of violences and crimes, and then having a national data set where these things can be reported. But the problem with that, again, is entrance convergence. In that moment, you have very violent crimes that are all over the news and groups are coming together to push for something. But now in this very moment, what we often see is even Black queer people, like the brother in New York, I can't remember his name, El Amin, who are charged, or at least initially charged, with hate crimes because they're not out about their sexuality. So in El Amin's case, he is a Black queer man, Muslim brother in New York. He's at a bar. A white gay dude hits him with his purse and calls him a nigger. El Amin then proceeds to fight this white man and his partner because he's taller than them, and because he's perceived to be straight because he is a big Black masculine muscular man with the Muslim hat on. Sorry, I don't know the term. In the court, the judge gives him a dressing down, and they attempt to give him a 20-year sentence until later it's revealed that he's also queer. And so this is not a anti-queer motivated attack. So what we often see with the hate crimes legislation is it actually becomes visited upon Black, queer, and trans people in their interactions or in the kind of violent encounters with white queer folks. And so this is another instance of where entrance convergence, even though to your point, gives us this nonlinear and sometimes very stable victory. That victory itself can become an entrapment for the despised class that kind of latches on to the interest of those that are more favored in society.
I have another one here from Nick that's actually pretty relevant to that question. How would you have courts address systemic racism or oppression and not turn it so they can excuse making even more oppressive changes and attempting to just wrap it in we should not just respect precedent? So I think the question here is, how do we make actual changes in the courts to address that systemic racism, as opposed to it just being wrapped up in something else that looks like we're fixing it?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the problem. This is the issue. Courts are political. Judges are picked by presidents and confirmed by senators who are all politicians with particular interests. And if you look at the history of our country, we've only had one Black president, right? So there are particular interests that have been confirmed and affirmed by virtue of who's making these decisions, right? And so that's something we have to think about. But to your point, one of the things I do is I teach my law students, yes, you must know precedent, you must understand how important precedent is for the practice of law and for when you go take the bars, you can pass this exam. But if you want to make change in the United States, particularly in the constitutional realm, we have to argue, and we have to begin to make the plain case to everyday folks and also lawyers that precedent is not holy, right? Judges, particularly judges from the 1700s and 1800s, are not Jesus Christ, Buddha, or anyone that is supposed to be infallible. In fact, they were very damaged, terrible, white supremacist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, nativist people. And until we can speak honestly about that, we can't get to the heart of these issues. And in the 1950s and 60s, with the Warren Court, when William Brennan was there and Chief Justice Earl Warren was there, who also, presided over the Japanese internment camps. He was governor of California, that should be noted. But also Thurgood Marshall was there. There was an attempt to start doing away with some of these precedents. One of the most kind of harangued precedents that we talk about now in class is, not only Plessy versus Ferguson, but also Dred Scott, where the judge said, you as a Black person and all Black people are actually not human. You can never be a citizen. You are bound and you owe duty or service or labor for life. Chief Justice, Supreme Court, right? And Dred Scott was held here, in a free state, ostensibly free state of Minnesota on the military base because it's not state property, right? And so what we have to begin to do is even challenge the notion of precedent, but also bolster where precedent has been strong, not because it's precedent, but because it's just. So for example, there are two legal theories that have been kind of beaten down. They were very strong in the 50s and 60s of disparate impact and disparate intent. So intent is like, you planned to screw people of color over in a way that was disproportionately harmful to them than anyone else, right? And disparate impact used to say, it don't matter what you planned. This is what happened. So it must be undone and folks must be made whole. So I think really a small step with a large impact would be reinstating the kind of full force of these legal doctrines and actually applying them both to citizens as private citizens, right? And to corporations and governments as it used to be.
I have another question from Eva. We do have a bit of a global audience here. So the question is, what's the relevance of critical race theory in Europe, and what's the rhetoric in other parts of the world, really in general?
Yeah, so critical race theory in Europe is actually really interesting, because if you think about how critical race theory operates in the United States, we're dealing with the afterlife of European coloniality, right? And so the same conversations that African Americans and other Black folks and people of color are having here in the United States, they're having the same critique, and particularly in the United Kingdom and France, but also all over the world in the former colonies, right? So if you look at, I know this isn't directly Europe, but if you look at what happened in South Africa, critical race theorists actually went over and helped write the new constitution there. But what they were saying was, look, you have a country that's 92, 94% Black or colored, as they would say there, and it's being ruled violently by these European colonialists with no regard for human life, right? It was Jim Crow on steroids. And when you look at what's happening in France, critical race theorists are critiquing the government for refusing to count people's race in formal documents, right? In national data. And that, of course, makes them invisible, makes their pains and their particularly, well, we were talking about disparate impact and intent earlier, it makes their situations invisibilized, and it makes them unable to kind of mount a defense or critique of a significant and data-grounded critique of the government. With the United Kingdom, we see what's happening with the citizenship of many Jamaican immigrants that came over a long time ago. So folks are here talking about, like we would the United States, the unstable Black citizenship from the 13th and 14th Amendment. They're saying, wait, we're dealing with something very similar. How is it that our citizenship, after we've worked low wages in this country for so long, for generations, can be revoked? And what does it mean when we're told that we don't belong here, when in fact, not only was the UK one of the larger slave holding and exporting countries at the time, well, in history, and the kind of innovator of slavery, but they continued to operate colonies that benefited off of the labor of people of color, not just Black people, people of color at large. So there are a lot of critiques that are happening, particularly in the UK and France, but also that are emerging in places like Germany. So there are a lot of scholars out there. What is the field called? I think that's also like a Black Atlantic studies, but also European critical race theory. There's a lot of work going on. So you just have to look at some of the new scholars that are out. I shouldn't even say new. Many of them are older than me. I'm just new to the European conversation.
So there's a question in regards to the artwork behind you. If you could give a quick overview of who each of them are, I guess really why they play a role here, and also who the artist or artists may be for those.
Yeah, so these are all done by the same artist, a Black woman from Pittsburgh, who may be here watching. I'm not sure if she's tuned in. Her name is Morgan Elizabeth, and I believe either her Twitter or her Instagram is Mo Elizabeth. But this is Frederick Douglass, who I read the first quotation from, author of My Bondage, My Freedom, and probably the first real known Black thinker in the United States, if not the world, a former slave who ran away and became one of the first Black diplomat as well. This here is Maya Angelou of I Know What the Caged Bird Sings fame, as well as And Still I Rise, which most people probably know her for. Next to her is the great Toni Morrison, author of Beloved, Jazz, so many books that I can't even begin to recount, and probably the mother of literature, really. Next to that is, I don't have to say much about them, James Baldwin, the probably greatest writer of the 50s and 60s. And then down to the left is the great Angela Davis, who was falsely arrested and accused of being involved with the murder of police after her guns were stolen. At the time, she was a young professor of philosophy, I believe, at either, was it Stanford or Berkeley, fluent in Russian and doing all this amazing work, but she was a member of the Communist Party. So Reagan and others tried to have her fired, and not only fired, but sentenced to prison, which of course she was not. So that's the story on them, but each of them come together as folks who are doing a critique of the ways in which anti-Blackness and anti-Black womanness sometimes, and with Baldwin, anti-Black queerness, are interwoven into the social fabric of the United States and oftentimes the world. And they're beginning to tell stories and create theories of the ways in which Black people can move and survive through these waves of violence and craft different ways of being and different future worlds for themselves, while also always already telling white folks the truth about themselves. And so for that reason, they were both revered as brilliant and creative and beautiful, but also denigrated by white moderates and sometimes liberals for dividing people. But their argument and their response was always the same. The truth cannot be divisive, and it's only divisive to those who wish to live in the lie.
Yeah, I mean, so question for me, specifically to that, you mentioned telling people about themselves. So what do you say when you get pushback from those people that are saying critical race theory is divisive and designed to make people feel guilty about their racial identity or being identified as an oppressor of some sort?
Yeah, so Toni Morrison has this wonderful, wonderful clip. You can find it on YouTube. Google Toni Morrison on white supremacy or racism. And she said, if you can only feel tall when you have broken me down to my knees, it seems that you have a problem. And maybe you should decide what you are going to do about it. Leave me out of it. And that's generally my response, because my work, for me personally, is not about denigrating or convincing white folks or racist or homophobic or transphobic people. If you're there, that's the hell you reside in, right? I'm not a savior. But my duty is to bear witness to the truth. My duty as someone who has been privileged enough to get a law degree and a PhD and interact with so many dope scholars and then everyday people who enrich me with the knowledge of their truths is to share that truth. In the Black community, we always talk about having a carry-on tradition. And that is not only about when you go through something rough to keep on keeping on and carry on, but it's also to carry the truths and the knowledge and the wisdom that you have with you, right? That you might testify and bear witness to the coming folks that you meet and the coming generation and the children that come next. And so it's very strange when some white people are like, this is about making me feel guilty. How dare you think you are so important in my life that your guilt is a motivating factor for me? That is insane. It's a type of narcissism. It needs medical treatments. But if you do feel guilty, there's a type of therapy you should engage in. Perhaps, if you have engaged in racism, whether casual, overt, very, very violent, or subtle, perhaps you should feel guilty for it. If I step on someone's foot, I apologize and I feel guilty for the harm that I caused because I am indeed guilty, right? If I were walking through a mall and I knock over someone's latte out of their hand, I would feel guilty and I would buy them another one. And so what we're really asking for is to remove the kind of casual disregard and indignities that people visit upon Black folks and people of color and say, wait a minute, let's take a pause here and tell the truth about some things so we can do the work of actually being truly unified and not sitting next to each other in close proximity and silent rage, right? And just not talking about what has happened. And this is what's been beautiful about places like South Africa, their national kind of justice, peace and justice and reconciliation project. It's like, we have to have the conversation so we can move on. Because the fact of the matter is, there was a study by one of the banks, I think it was Citibank, that said, racism has cost the United States trillions of dollars. Racism is costly, not only in economic terms and innovation terms, but also in terms of the psyches of people that have to go on every day. One, for white supremacists believing a mythology. If you believe that, you probably aren't doing much in the world that's good. And if you're a person of color, having to always walk with a type of what uh, Douglass and Du Bois have called double consciousness. Not only knowing who you are as yourself, but also having to translate yourself and transmute yourself into the imagery that someone that is racist might see you as, in order not to be killed, or in order not to lose your job, or in order to be paid a fair wage, or in order not to be stopped by the police or called the police on you by a barbecue Becky or a Miss Cooper with her dog.
Why do you think there is such a big focus on equity in education? Shouldn't we just treat all students equally, is a question that has come through. And then I guess I'll add on to that. How do blatant critical race theory bans harm students of color and their white classmates?
Yeah. So I would say the focus on equity is because equality has never existed and it doesn't work. You cannot treat someone equally until you have an equitable stake in their being or in their success. And that, I mean, they show this image all the time, and now there's a new one, right, that I've seen. And so equality is really about equal access or treatment to something. So say there's an apple tree. Say I'm 6'3", and Kim is 5'8". Well, the apple tree is just at 6 feet. Now, the person that's running the tour has treated us equally. They picked us up from our house and they dropped us off at the apple tree. But Kim can't reach no apple. So she's just sitting there looking crazy after all the money she's paid. Equitable treatment would be like, wait a minute. Now, Kim is 5'8". She needs 4 more inches. So they would provide Kim with a device or a stair or something that not only allows her to reach the apples and reach whatever apple I can get, but to do so in a way that requires the same amount of energy that it causes me. So it's not just giving her a stool and trying to figure out how she's gonna get up there and not get blown off by the wind, but it's about applying a safe, secure, and equitable, comfortable access in a way that is the same as other people that have different types of powers, abilities, or privileges. And the question of critical race theory is really interesting because most people that are talking about banning critical race theory don't even know what it is. So it's oftentimes very laughable because they can't even define it in law. They'll be like, just critical race theory. I'm like, so baby, what is it? What have you read? Can you define it? And they start talking about all these strange things that critical race theorists have never said. But I do think that the rhetoric itself is harmful enough to students of color because it goes to say that, one, your history, your voice itself is criminal. To talk about the way you experience the world, to talk about the way your grandmother experienced the world, or any of your ancestors or siblings or cousins is in fact illegal testimony. That is crazy. To think about your truth is illegal. And to also then note that when you learn about Black history in school, it's generally 1 month. The rest of the school year, you're learning generally white history, and you might have a page on Martin Luther King. You might have a couple of pages on slavery, which never gets down to the details of what actually happened. And that's the grand sum of things. And maybe now there's a page on Barack Obama, but that is essentially it. And so to rob someone of their history is to also rob this nation of the ability to create a foundation that is innovative and equitable for everyone. Because if I don't know where I've been, I don't know how to get to where I need to go. And so I think that is the problem. And not only does it hurt students of color, it also hurts white students because they lack the ability and the facility to understand what are the real social relations that are happening around them, right? Why are so many folks of color in prison? Surely it can't be because they're naturally criminal, right? But instead that these laws are constructed in particular ways that affect folks with a disparate impact because the intent itself was disparate. So I think is what it does is it distorts reality for everyone. And when reality is distorted, you cannot build a healthier or more kind of rich, generally, even economically speaking, future for all.
How do we, or how do critical race theorists accurately, or is it even their attempt to accurately reflect the experiences of victims of racism or homophobia and so on?
Yeah. So I think that one reason that I think is oftentimes very accurate is because when critical race theorists, mostly legal scholars and also scholars in other realms now, sociology, Black studies, what have you, there's a very rigorous review process when you're trying to publish something. So for folks that are not in academia, when you try to publish an article, for example, it goes through many levels of review, and most articles are not published. There's a revise and resubmit because, oh, this sentence right here sounds great, but it's not accurate. I can't find the source, right? And so oftentimes as well, critical race theorists are sometimes writing about their own personal experience. So that's generally going to be more accurate because you're talking about yourself, but also talking about things they've seen or witnessed over their lifetime. So it doesn't behoove anyone, particularly a critical race theorist or someone who just engages critical race theory, because everyone doesn't identify as, you know, a title for a theory that they use. But it behooves folks to tell the truth because there's generally an ethical and a values question. And that is the reason that you're engaging in critical race theory in the first place. Because critical race theory, going back to the words of Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the dean of Howard Law School and the mentor of Thurgood Marshall and Pauli Murray, he says, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And that is the ethos of critical race theorists. So it's almost like kind of being a journalist. If you're not going to tell the truth, this probably isn't the realm for you. But maybe that's a bad example, seeing where journalism has gone today.
So if anyone has any other questions, please drop them in the chat. But I think I'm going to ask my final question, really to just conclude everything here that you've passed on your knowledge to us. What do you feel like is the end goal of critical race theory?
The end of racial domination and subordination. The goal of critical race theory is that every person, every child, every elder can expect a high quality of life that is not impeded by the color of their skin or the color of the skin of those that they are affiliated with. The idea of critical race theory is to actually realize the promise of the Constitution, equal protection under the laws, equal enforcement of the laws, being the actual ending of racial subordination under the 13th Amendment. We want the law to actually be what it promised to be. And I think that is the call of all critical race theorists. It's that, what if America was what it said it was? What if it was the greatest country in the world? What if you could just be born and have talents and dreams and realize them and not be discriminated against because of how you look? Where might we be? And so those are the questions that critical race theorists are asking. And those are also the futures that critical race theorists are trying to get this country to finally both midwife and birth and raise up to fruition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for joining us and giving us a full overview of critical race theory and its applications. Your knowledge here is just endless and it's greatly appreciated.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you folks for listening. If there's follow-up questions or things like that, I think my profile is available, so you can engage in that way.
Of course. And if anyone can find Dr. Wilson, be sure to send your questions to me and I will pass them along. Remember that this recording will be available on Acquia's YouTube channel in just a few days. Actually, I think we had a raised hand. Did someone have a question? Oh, everyone is saying thank you. That's what it is. Oh. And they love everything that you've gone through, saying that it's raw, powerful. Thank you so much. I second all of those comments. And thank you everyone for joining. Again, if you have any questions, you can filter them through me, or if you can reach out to Dr. Wilson yourself. that he just offered himself to you guys. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. Y'all take care.